We created the Sunulator to help people answer the question, is solar worth it?
Hi, I'm Andrew Redaway from the Alternative Technology Association. And this video is on Sunulator, which is a free solar feasibility calculator that you can download from our website and just do an internet search on the word Sunulator. This video is part of a series that covers material in our standard Sunulator training course, which we've already delivered in several cities. This video is a bit of a different one. Most of our others have focused on specific areas of Sunulator, from number 2 down to number 7, consumption through to tariffs in the menu. However, those videos did skip over functionality in Sunulator that's used for community solar projects and projects which are financed by an investor who's separate from the electricity consumer. So that's what this video is going to cover off, is to show you how that functionality can work. What I've done is kept the same consumption data, so it's still for a household, and same tariff, but what I've done is in the model section, instead of having different scenarios that have different battery capacity, I've set them to new scenario names: consumer owned, cons owned, community owned or investor owned, which is the com own, and project finance, which is the proj fin. So what we're going to do is keep everything else the same and just look at the effect of different ownership options for the solar system. So they've all got a solar system with a rated capacity of 4 kilowatts. The battery capacity is now gone, so we've got no batteries in any of the solar systems. In the costs, everything's still the same, but of course, with the battery capacity gone, there's now no cost for the battery system, and so the system cost is identical for the 3 scenarios. And if we move on to the community ownership options, and this is a big change here. So business as usual is consumer owned. The cons owned scenario is consumer owned, so that's where the household is paying for the solar system. They own it themselves, and they're getting the bill savings directly. Community owned is where the household is not paying for the solar system, so they're paying nothing up front, which is a fairly attractive option. However, they will have to pay for energy which is generated from their solar system through a meter which the community group or the financing company installs. And then with the next scenario, again, the household does not own the solar system. It's provided through a lease or a loan arrangement. So the household has to pay back interest repayments on that loan. We'll go into more details on the next sheet. So now when we click next, it will not skip over the community variables sheet as we saw in the cost video. Because we've made these changes here, the community variable sheet is now relevant, so it'll go into it. Alright, so this just repeats what we've done as a reminder. It's quite easy to see which scenario is which, because I've chosen scenario names that match the community ownership option. Now, how many years until the consumer takes ownership of the system? Well, in the consumer owned, it doesn't make any difference. In the community owned and the project finance, what we're saying is that even though the consumer pays nothing to install up front, after 10 years, the ownership of the system will transfer to the consumer. So the investor or the community group will have to, if it wants to make money out of the project, it'll have to make money in those 10 years. It's pretty normal for the ownership to go back to the to transfer to the electricity consumer, the owner of the site where the roof is, because investors probably don't want to be dealing with old systems that may need repair or upgrades in the future, people moving house, all that kind of stuff. So it transfers over to the consumer ownership after that time. So of course after it transfers over, then the consumers will get all of the bill savings directly. That they won't have to pay any loan repayments or energy payments to the investors, but they will take over the responsibility for any equipment replacement. Now the number of installs is just one. That's just a simple scenario. If you were a community group that was planning a project, you may have some upfront costs that you want to spread over several installations, in which case you can play with that number to see how the finances would compare if that was like 10 solar installations or 100 rather than just one. You may recall in the cost section we talked about the discount rate for the consumer, and we had that set to 2.5% to be a rate that's applicable for a home loan, excluding the consumer price index component of it, the inflation component. We can set a separate discount rate for the investor. So often a financial organisation will have a relatively high discount rate because they want to make money reasonably quickly. If they don't put money if they don't invest in the solar project, they may have other opportunities that they can invest money in that would earn them 5% or 8% or whatever, excluding the inflation. So that's the appropriate rate that you'd choose. Entity establishment. So if you're a community group and you have to set up a association or a company or whatever to just get off the ground, then there's legal and accounting and administration costs with that you may have to allow for. In this example, I've set them to 0, so let's assume that the investor is already set up. Same with the management costs, the annual management costs per year. Let's assume that they're running anyway, so whether this project goes ahead or not won't really make any significant difference. Metering installation. So for a community-owned or a power purchase agreement type system, you need to have some way to meter and measure how much electricity is being generated by the solar system and being so you probably need to install a meter for that purpose, which will have a cost. If it's more of an informal arrangement, then you may be able to agree with the energy consumer to base it off the inverter's own generation tracking readout. Other benefits, some community organisations may receive other benefits, like for example if it's a council, a local government council, they may have some targets that they have to meet for going carbon neutral or carbon offsetting. So if they can achieve that through solar installations as part of a as part of a solar project, they may be able to save money they would otherwise need to spend on purchasing carbon offsets. And yeah, you can use those cells for any other benefits that would come from that project. Now, let's say the if we look at this one, the community ownership option scenario, so the energy consumer is going to be buying electricity off the community group or the investor through the meter out of the solar system. So we need to set a rate, a tariff per kilowatt hour, and we've got that at 20 cents per kilowatt hour. That's relatively high for this. You can play around with different values and see how that changes the project attractiveness to both the investor and the consumer. Another question is the solar tariff basis. So this one is a drop down. There's two options. Either the electricity consumer is going to pay for everything that's generated out of the solar system, or they're going to pay for only what's used on site. So in most cases it would be all solar generation. That's a simpler metering option. One thing to be aware of there, though, is it's a potential trap for the electricity consumer. Let's say they go away on holidays. Their solar system's generating on the roof. Pretty much everything it generates is going straight out to the grid, and that's not earning anyone a lot of money because of the low feed-in tariffs you can get from an electricity retailer. However, the electricity consumer is paying 20 cents per kilowatt hour for all the solar generation at that time, even though they're not really using it. So that's something to watch out for. If you are often away from home, or you're putting on a solar system that's oversized and it's going to be exporting a lot of its generation, then that may have a negative effect on your electricity costs. The other option here is what's going to happen with the feed-in tariff payments for excess solar generation that gets fed into the grid, and the retailer will pay a feed-in tariff on the bill. Normally that would go to the consumer, because the consumer still has a bill, still has an account with the electricity retailer for the grid, and they'll be paying that feed-in tariff. Now, the next section is for loan variables, which is relevant to the project financing option. So what interest rate, what annual interest rate is going to be charged? So 8% per year, it works out to $835 that the electricity consumer will be paying to the investors as interest payments on their loan or their lease. And again, you can play with that value. Note that this is Sunulator's doing a relatively high level financial assessment. It's not going down to a sort of frequency of loan repayment option. It's just looking at a annual frequency of repayment. So depending on how often you are actually paying back the interest, that would have an impact on the interest rate that would be applicable. So once you get down to that level of negotiation, then a separate spreadsheet or a separate analysis would be needed to work out the final interest rate that would be charged to the consumer. Retailer variables. This is if you're setting up with a community electricity retailer, which is another option in Sunulator. It's at this stage, the way the electricity market is set up, it's very hard to achieve that. So I won't spend a lot of time, but you can have a look in the user guide. And then after that, there's also a section on tax. Now, we're not going into a lot of details on taxation in Sunulator because it's so dependent on individual situations, and it can change so frequently from one year to the next. But we have allowed in just a small section on depreciation and how that might affect the project attractiveness for the community group or the investors. Right, so we've entered in some at least placeholder values there. We can now click next. Costs, variables, future changes. We saw this in the video on costs. We'll just click on that. Run Sunulator. I've already run Sunulator, so we can go straight to the results section. We can click straight on that. Next, and go to the stats. All right. Environmental results, system sizing, it's all the same. Now, the consumer financial stats. So the upfront solar battery investment, the consumer only has to pay for that in the first scenario, the consumer-owned scenario. With the community-owned and the project finance, they don't have to pay. Now, the annual electricity cost. So in the business as usual scenario with no solar system, $1,569. With the consumer owned, they're getting a good saving from the solar system off their bill with their grid retailer, so it's going down to $901. With the next one, the community owned, it's actually gone up. And the reason for that is that they're now effectively getting two electricity bills for different energy. They're still getting their bill from the grid retailer, which would be the $901, but they're also getting a bill from the community group or the investors for electricity that's generated by the solar system, which we'll see later on is about $1,100. So yes, they've got a solar system on the roof which they haven't had to pay anything up front for, and that is reducing their bill from their grid retailer. But when you include the bill that they're getting from their the financing for the solar system through a power purchase agreement, they're actually coming out worse off. So it looks like that 20-cent option for the cost of electricity generated by the solar system is too high from the point of view of the consumer. With the project financing, their electricity cost is only what comes from the grid retailer, but you now have this annual loan repayment of $835 as well. So then when we add up those numbers, $1,736 per year for the project finance option, which again is higher than the business as usual with no solar system. So it doesn't look that attractive, but hold that thought. We'll see some interesting charts later on. Okay, so from the consumer point of view, we can look at the return on investment. Would be a good stat maybe, but yeah, it's not coming out too well. So yeah, it looks okay for the consumer-owned option, with the same numbers that we saw in the results video, but yeah, it's not looking that attractive for the other options. Okay, that was all from the consumer point of view. We'll now look at the section on the investor financial stats. So for the investor, they've got an establishment cost of $1,000 for the community-owned power purchase agreement option, and that was to install the additional meter to measure how much electricity is coming out of the solar system. In both of these cases, the investors are paying for the solar system. In the PPA, Power Purchase Agreement, community-owned option, the investors are receiving $1,112 per year through energy payments from the energy consumer to the investor through the meter, and $835 for the loan revenue for the project finance option. So that gives us the basic annual cash flow if we allowed for additional benefits or additional costs, management costs, etc. Or if there was maintenance and cleaning included, because that would be it would be the investors who would have to cover that. Right, from an investor's point of view, they're going to be looking at a payback period, simple payback period, 7 years, discounted 8 to 10 years, return on investment 10%. That's looking pretty good. Okay, so those are the key stats that we're looking at to compare the different ownership options. Let's look at some charts. There's not much interesting to see in the consumption and generation. We've just got each scenario has the same solar system, so we'll go on. Now this is a very interesting chart, and this is the discounted cash flow for the consumer, and the electricity consumer. So the business as usual. It's all compared to the scenario business as usual. So if we look at the green one, that's similar to what we saw in the video on the results. So the consumer is paying close to $6,000 for their solar system. So they're starting out negative that much, and then each year they're getting bill savings that's bringing them back to a break-even situation. By comparison, with the community-owned and the project finance scenarios, the consumer pays nothing up front, so their starting position looks good. However, as we saw on the stats sheet, their combined bill, once you include the retailer's bill and either the bill from the investors or the loan repayments to the investors, is higher than what they were paying with no solar system. So they're actually going backwards. If we look at the project finance one, going backwards, then in year 10 the system ownership transfers over. The consumer now owns it, and coincidentally the inverter is up for replacement in year 11. So that puts them more negative. However, after that point, there's no more loan repayments to the investors, so they get to keep the entire bill saving each year after that, and going up parallel to the line for if they'd own the system from the start, and they achieve a break even in 17 or 18 years. Similar with the community owned, but with that 20 cent per kilowatt hour bill, that works out more expensive than the project finance at the 8% interest rate. So they end up in a worse situation in year 10 or year 11. So with those bill savings, they only achieve payback in about year 27. So that's from the consumer point of view, with the values that we've entered in. Obviously, with different interest rates and tariff amounts, that would look a bit different. We can also look at a discounted cash flow for the investor. Now, for the investors, the ownership is transferring over after year 10. So they're relatively short lines that we're looking at. And you also might immediately notice there's the lines are more curved than they are for the consumer. And that's because the investor, we've entered in a higher discount rate. So they're really valuing returns in the future less than returns in the first year or two. So with the community owned, they're paying for the system, and they're also paying for the meter to measure the generation of the solar system. So that starts a bit more negative, but then they're getting that $1,100 payment every year for the generation out of the solar system. Well, in fact, it'll reduce slightly as the panels degrade, and Sunulator will have taken that into account. But that achieves payback in year 7 or 8. With project finance, lower upfront costs because they don't need any special metering equipment. But with that interest rate, their interest earned every year is only it's only just achieving payback in year 10. But as we saw, a 10-year payback works out to a pretty attractive internal rate of return or equivalent interest rate on the investment. Well, it's attractive from a normal person's point of view. Whether it's attractive from a big corporation, maybe not. So those are probably the main charts to look at. There's several others you can explore as well. But what I'll now do is go on to the next sheet, which is specific to community-owned solar systems or investor-owned. Let's look at maybe the project finance. So what this one is intended for is if you have a community group which is investing in a solar system, say they're going to put solar panels on the local community centre or old person's home or whatever it may be. They're going to need to raise capital to make that investment, and in order to do that, they're ideally they'd be raising that money from the local community. So they'll need to give people an idea of what sort of returns they might be expecting. So they're going to be paying $5,600 in year 0 and getting an $835 each year after that. And if we convert that to a per dollar basis, for each dollar that someone invests in year 0, they'd be getting back 15 or 14.9 cents after that. Which you need to get a reasonable dollar value coming back to recoup the initial investment as well. So this may be useful if the community group was trying to provide information to potential investors. In reality, they would probably not structure the payment exactly like this. They'd probably provide some sort of sinking fund or whatever to be able to cover any unexpected expenses, and maybe they'd structure it so they're paying out a smaller return each year, but then be able to repay the capital at the end of the project. But as a starting point, this gives potential investors an idea of what sort of return they may be getting per dollar invested. So that's it for the community solar project option and the different ownership options in Sunulator. I hope you find it useful.